Grace and peace to all of you this morning. Ken alluded to the subject I was going to address this morning, and I will admit I have, generally speaking, a good block of time in which to contemplate what message or what subject I should take up when I do preach, since I don't take a turn as frequently as the others. And I will admit this subject I picked up and dropped multiple times as I tried to sort through what I should share on this morning. I did want to say at the outset, my goal this morning is to humbly present to you my perspective on some biblical passages and a few practical implications that I feel relate to our attempt to update our dress standard. It occurred to me, stood out to me, or felt important to me that as we looked into other sections of our standard of practice, we had, I felt like, a significant amount of teaching surrounding our efforts to understand how we should come to some conclusion about how we should do these things. And I was listening and thinking about the discussions that have been happening. The ladies have had a meeting, the brothers had a meeting, we're talking about this, and I'm thinking, there needs to be some teaching. And I encourage my fellow ministers that I hope they take up additional messages on the subject. I don't feel like I have the final word. I don't feel like I even totally understand all of the things I'm talking about this morning. I do hope that my fellow ministers can possibly take up additional aspects of this and possibly correct any misguided emphases that I have. But I do think we should have help to think with discernment and wisdom about how we make clothing choices. I think there are principles that can be found, principles that we can apply. As we look at this, though, and as I speak this morning, I wanted to say at the outset, I do want you to feel free to have a different perspective. As I look at you all here this morning, and as I thought about what shapes my perception of the subject, I feel like my background, the life experiences I had in getting to this point, have definitely shaped how I feel about the subject. And as I look at you all, I feel that's very true for you all as well. You have a different perspective than I do, and I think that's good and important. I also hope that you can challenge my premises. I don't mind that, or question the deductions and conclusions I present this morning. In fact, I welcome that. You don't need to do it publicly, but I certainly would welcome privately, and if you feel so compelled to say any challenges publicly, that's fine too. I did want to be right up front about what I feel like are my starting premises as I thought about this subject of principles of modesty. Because I think we all come to a subject like this with starting premises. And I feel like too often they go unstated, and we don't acknowledge that this is a premise that we're starting from. And for me, the starting premise that I realized as I dug into the subject is that I believe that God does really care about how people dress. I believe God has an opinion about what people wear and how they present themselves in public. After all, he dressed Adam and Eve in the garden. And we don't have to go back there and read the story for you to remember that after Adam and Eve partake of the forbidden fruit, they had a realization of nakedness. Something changed, and it was in their minds, not in their situation or place or bodily appearance. Something changed in their minds, and they were aware of their nakedness. And they had initial attempts to clothe themselves. They realized it was a problem. They made clothes, and it's clear that God felt like those clothes were not adequate or sufficient, because it says God made clothes for them and clothed them. Not only did God address clothing to the very first people, who you may remember also were living by themselves in the garden, the only two people, God had a thought about how they dressed. God does speak specifically in the Bible about how Christians are to dress in the New Testament. And I think you'll agree with me that I think you will agree with me that there are not a lot of specific, what I call specific application instructions. There doesn't seem to be a lot of specific details about clothing, but there are principles. In fact, there are more principles than we'll have time to address this morning. I don't intend for this to be an exhaustive look at Bible verses about modesty. My second starting premise is that as a community of believers, I believe we should speak into the practical decisions of our everyday lives. In other words, I believe it's important for believers to talk to each other and to hold each other accountable for how we live with practical decisions, including the decisions we make about our clothing. There is a thought that I think we should push back against that says what I do and what I wear is my choice and it's mine only. And I think we should push back on it because I think it's clear from the Scriptures that God intends for people to live in community. And there are passages that talk about the body and the illustration or the image of the parts of the body working together. And there are verses about the ability for believers to admonish each other and to speak into each other's lives. And so I believe that God intends us to live in communities that are self-edifying, self-correcting, and giving guidance to each other. My third premise is that I believe that clothing choices speak. What you wear says something. What you choose not to wear says something as well. As I was trying to understand how to get my point across here, or how to make this practical, I brought along a few pieces of clothing, and I don't know if you thought about how you perceived my appearance up here, but I wonder how it changes when I do this. So I can't ask you, and I mean I'm not going to ask you, did this change your perception of me? Think about that. Now, I don't often wear a suit coat, partly for the reason I don't wear a coat. A lot of the times, as many of you know, I don't do the coat thing very much. But, in some settings, yes, this would definitely change a person's perception of me. So, that's one possibility. And I wonder, does this make any difference? Sorry, this one's a little warmer. I don't hope to have this one on quite as long. I don't know. Does that make a different impression on your mind? Do you think a different thought about who I am? Does it give you a different impression? I think it says something. Sorry, then the third one. I'd be curious how this affects your perception of me. I won't take the time for all the buttons, but I don't want to keep y'all waiting. So, I think it says something different, right? By judging from your faces, yes, it does say something different. Now, I'll be frank, I find this much more comfortable than either the other two options that I had. But I think it does say something different. So, you can tell me afterwards. I'd be really curious to hear from any of you what those different piece is said to you. I would have had a fourth if I could have borrowed it in time. But you'll have to imagine what it would be like if I was up here with a black leather coat with chrome chains. Notice they were all black. They're all cloth. And they're just slight stylistic differences. In fact, you could probably say there's, other than the sleeve difference on one of them, there's not that much different. But I think that there really is a different message conveyed by each of those. And thank you for being merciful to me and not requiring me to wear a coat while I'm up here speaking. I believe our clothing speaks. What it says is a question, and that question varies by the person seeing it. It varies by the person's attitude who's wearing it, and there's a lot of complications to that. But I want to acknowledge it is one of my starting premises that our clothing choices do speak, and sometimes speak quite loudly. And so you're probably wondering, where are we going to go for a biblical text as it relates to principles of modesty? And I intend to take us to a text that I don't think is usually considered as a passage advocating modestly. And it doesn't directly, but I think it does speak to how we approach the subject of modesty. And I'd like for you to go to the book of Micah, chapter 6. In the book of Micah, one of the minor prophets, I would say there's a contest, a controversy between God and his people. And God's people are no longer living in a way that's pleasing to God. And God is in a dialogue with them through his prophet. And I wanted to read a few verses from chapter 6. And this is where I'd like to draw our minds as we think about principles of modesty. So in chapter 6, God says through Micah, "Hear ye now what the Lord saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth, for the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel." I'm sorry, that's not where I wanted to start. My apologies. He's talking about how, to summarize it, God did things for his people, and what are they doing for God, or what's their response to God? I wanted to start in verse 6. This is the person's answer back to God. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? In other words, God is saying, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and the people are saying, well, what are we supposed to do? And I feel like the reply there is almost a little bit of a mocking reply. Well, what do you want? But not necessarily in a serious voice. But God replies, I believe, with a concise statement of what God really does want. He hath showed thee, verse 8, he hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. That's where I want to focus this morning, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. These principles, I think, could probably be applied widely to many different biblical and practical situations. But I think we can apply them to our understanding of modesty today. What does it mean to do justly as it relates to modesty and clothing issues and decisions? Well, I believe if we're going to be just, I believe we're going to be fair or considerate or living with true principles, not taking advantage of other people, I think is a core concept of justice. And I'd like for us to think about some verses in Thessalonians in Paul's instructions to the churches as a follow-up to think about how we can do justly as it relates to clothing and our decisions about what is modest or immodest. In 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul is talking to the believers. Excuse me. 1 Thessalonians 4. I think we'll start reading in verse 1. This is what Paul has to say to the Thessalonians. Furthermore, then, we beseech you, brethren, and exhort you by the Lord Jesus, that as ye have received of us how ye ought to walk and to please God, so ye would abound more and more. For ye know what commandments we gave you by the Lord Jesus. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, even as the Gentiles which know not God, that no man go beyond and defraud his brother in any matter, because that the Lord is an avenger of all such, as we also have forewarned and testified. For God hath not called us to uncleanness, but unto holiness. And I think he's using the word man there in a sense of person, that no person or brother or sister go beyond and defraud any other. How does this apply to dress? I wanted to insert the commandments that Paul is speaking to. He also references in other places. 1 Timothy, just page over a few places, we see some of the instructions that Paul gave to Timothy to give to the church. In verse 9 of 1 Timothy, he says, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. I believe Paul is saying in 1 Thessalonians that he gave specific instructions to the churches, and sometimes I wish we had the specific instructions that Paul gave more than he has in the letters, the pastoral epistles. But I think Paul gave specific instructions on how the believers were to live, and for both men and women, he says, in like manner. I don't think he addresses this only to the women, but he gave specific instructions to the churches. And he tells us that God's will for us is our sanctification. Sanctification meaning being set apart for God. And so I hear in Paul's plea to the church that God wants your body to be set aside for him. And Paul follows that up by saying, if your body is set aside for him, then you're not going to use your body to defraud or take advantage of each other. Every one of you should know how to possess his vessel, I think meaning his body, with sanctification and honor, and not in the lust of concupiscence or lust of desire. This, I believe, is not speaking only to women. This is more than that. I believe there's something that we have not found good ways to talk about that we should, and I would hope in our continued discussions about clothing, we find a way to talk about how what I wear and when I wear it affects other people's desires and thoughts about me. And I think that does apply both to men and women. You could say, well, how is that fraudulent, or how could that take advantage? I encounter this a lot in what I would call the non-sanctified world. In the trade shows I go to, or salespeople who come to where I work to sell things, I encounter a lot of men and women who are using their clothing or their accessories in a way that accents the desirability of their bodies to get my attention. They're using how they look to get my attention. I think, well, I should say it feels fraudulent to me when a person uses their characteristics, whether it's a woman or a man, uses their characteristics in what can seem like a suggestion of desirability with no intention or thought of providing availability. So I want you to want me, and it should stop there. That feels fraudulent to me. Maybe you see it differently, and I'd be happy to hear from you about that if I'm understanding that wrong. I think that there's a God-given desire in every person to want to be noticed, to feel needed, to have a perception that I am worth something. I think that's a natural God-given desire. We probably vary in how much we want that notice to be public or given in a large group, or how much we want it to be private and individual. But I think it crosses over a line or is something different when we want that, when we use our appearance to be noticed. And I feel it feels like I'm walking on a knife edge there. And I think there's a lot of question is how does that work out? How does that become practical? I believe that's where modesty comes in and how modesty is worked out. I don't think Christian men should be using their wealth or their style to be noticed. And I don't believe that Christian women should be using their feminine appearance to be noticed. What should be noticed then? So that was a question I asked myself. If I have a God-given desire to be known as someone or to be noticed, what should be noticed? Well, I think our modesty should be noticed. So how does that get practical? How is that real? And I hope to come back to talking about that more later. I think while we want to be noticed, I think what people should notice when they see us is a simple, graceful reflection of God's attributes. So I think that's what the Christian should want to have noticed by other people. So when people see you, they see God's attributes in you. And hopefully they also see a reflection of themselves or see attention being reflected back to them. I found an interesting example of this in a book I was reading. It's called Lessons in Leadership by a Jewish rabbi named Jonathan Sachs. And as a young man, he wanted to interview this prominent rabbi known as the Rebbe. And it was difficult to get an appointment. In fact, when he first called, they kind of laughed at him and said, who do you think you are, basically, to try to get an interview with him. But when he was actually in the room speaking with the Rebbe, something struck him, and he noted, almost as soon as he entered the room, that there was no charisma, there was no overflowing personality surrounding this man. He writes, to the contrary, he was so self-effacing that there seemed to be only one person in the room, the person to whom the Rebbe was speaking. I thought that was notable, that as he's talking to this prominent rabbi, he felt like he himself was the only person in the room, because the Rebbe was constantly directing the attention back to Jonathan. And very soon, in spite of the questions that Jonathan had, very soon the rabbi was turning those questions right around back to him and asking about what he was doing and what he was hoping to do, and challenging Jonathan to think about what God could do through him. As I thought about the people that I have appreciated greatly for modesty, I realized there were people that, as I thought about them, I had difficulty picturing them because their appearance was so unnotable. What attracted to me wasn't how they appeared, it was the conversations I had with them. the communication and the fact that they often made the conversation about me, not about them. And I think that's a core principle of modesty. I believe that there's a fine line between being tasteful and wearing beautiful clothing, which I don't believe is wrong, and using that beautiful clothing to draw the attention and notice of others. Like I said, I hope to address this later in more detail. But I believe as we think about that fine line between enjoying beautiful things and being tasteful, and then going across a line that begins to draw attention and the notice of others, I think that's where the next instruction in Micah comes into play. And that is God's instruction to us to love mercy. And I feel like if there's any area of our standard of practice where we need to have mercy for each other, or to love mercy in all of its expressions, and to wish God's mercy on others, it's in clothing choices. I don't know if any of you in the brothers' meeting were listening to what sometimes can feel like judgmental statements about other people's clothing choices. We do. We make judgments about how other people dress. I think naturally, just subconsciously, we do this. But I believe as a brotherhood that we need to cultivate a non-judgmental approach to observations about the clothing choices of other people. This is a quote. I should have taken the time to explore who said this. But the quote was, Love will lend us one safe rule, that we impose a severer rule upon ourselves and allow a larger indulgence to others." That's not to condone sin in other people or to say it doesn't matter what others wear. But I think you'll agree with me that we naturally do the opposite. We generally give ourselves lots of latitude for the decisions we make. In other words, we self-justify the choices we make, and we look with fairly rigid, narrow eyes at what other people are doing. And I don't think that's helpful. I do think we need to talk, frankly, about what we're seeing in other people's choices. We need to talk about the messages that their clothing are communicating. We need to talk about what we're hearing and what we're seeing. But I would sincerely hope that as we do that, as we enter into those discussions, we can do it with a lot of mercy. Because after all, none of us came to this place in our lives or our church life by the same route or through the same cultural backgrounds. Our families, our early years all influence what we think feels normal or right. It definitely affects what we think is proper. And I'm afraid that too often, I myself am guilty of what I would call projection. And I think this happens as we think about modesty and clothing choices in modesty. Projection is where I look at someone else, so I look at someone else's clothes, and I think in my mind, if I was them and I wore that, I would likely be thinking, and you can fill in the blank. Or if that was me, this is why I would have done that. Or if I wore that, that would mean I wanted, and you fill in the blank. But that's not merciful. That's not extending mercy to each other. That's extending judgment. And I don't think it's fair or right to do that. I think, especially when it comes to clothing choices, we should be talking to each other about why. What influences you to do that? What principles, what expectations do you have as you wear that? What message do you think this is conveying when you wear that? And in fact, I've had my vest for some time, but I felt like it would actually be a distraction if I wore it. I don't think, I think while it would be comfortable for me, and I like the style personally, I think it would be a little bit of a distraction, and I don't want my clothing to be a distraction. I don't want to put that in the conversation. But if I did, I would hope you could talk to me and say, well, what's up with this? What are you thinking? What do you like about it? What does it say to you? Or what part of what you want to communicate is in there? And for me, I like the vest, number one, because it doesn't have sleeves and my arms get quite warm. But I also like that vest because it doesn't have a satin back. It's a full cloth back. And I think it fits with my straight cut coat. So I have reasons and logic for why I like it. And I think the more we can have conversations with each other about our clothing choices, and the less presumptions we can make about our clothing choices and others' clothing choices, the better off we'll be, and the more we can enter into God's instruction to love mercy. And I think part of modesty is a mercy shown to others. I think it's a key part of it. Lastly, God's instruction to his people was to walk humbly. To me, there's a very close and tight connection between humility and modesty. I don't know how you see that connection in your mind, but I think we should draw a line there, draw a connection there. I believe modesty is the expression of humility. That humility is what gets worked out in modest clothing. The challenge is, though, that trying to define and talk about modesty and what is modest and what's not modest can frankly feel like a minefield. It can feel dangerous. And one person might say, well, if you say that's immodest, then that must mean your mind is going evil places. Or if you have a problem with that, what's wrong with you? Or no, I don't think that's immodest at all. It's perfectly fine in my mind. And it feels to me like that modesty is one of those chameleon words. It's used so frequently and in so many different contexts that if somebody says, well, is that modest? I wonder, okay, really, what do they mean? Like, what are they trying to say? It feels like modesty means many things to many different things to many different people. And often its use is tied to the context and to the person speaking. Like, what are they talking about, and who is it that's talking about modesty? Besides all that, I think modesty is often used as a euphemism. I don't know if you know what a euphemism is. Basically, a euphemism is a word that stands in place of a more accurate or correct word, but that I don't want to say in this context. So I don't want to say this other word, so I use a euphemism in place of it. And so sometimes we say modesty meaning simple in appearance, or modest in the sense of not loud or bright. But other times it can be modest as in not sexually suggestive. And it feels like this word modest is called in to stand in place in a lot of places. And so one of the questions I wrestled with as I was preparing for this message is just this: is there any objectivity that can be brought to the subject of modesty? How can we be objective about modesty? Or is the whole question of what's modest and immodest only in the eye of the beholder? So is it only up to me to observe modesty or immodesty in others? And I feel like sometimes some people have given up on the subject and said, well, it feels so elusive, how can we really know, and let's just leave it. And I think if you try to define modesty by itself, that is futile. But I think if you connect it to humility, then it has something to stand on. and that we can actually make a definition if we connect modesty and humility. In my mind, as I thought about defining what modesty is, I would say it's one of the ways that humility gets put into action. So I believe that humility is a cardinal Christian virtue. It's just something that all Christians should have. And humility is going to be lived out in multiple ways. There are multiple ways that our humility becomes visible to other people. And I believe that modesty is one of the primary ways in which our humility gets put into practice. And I would define, and this is not original with me, that modesty is dressing or acting or speaking with propriety, respect, and moderation. We don't use that word propriety very often, but basically means what's proper for my time and place. So you'll notice that there is an element of the subjective to it, because different times and different places have a different sense for what is proper for me to be doing. And I think we ought to have a sensitivity to that. I think Kenneth mentioned in some of his comments about India that in that context and place, there are different expectations of modesty. And I don't think it would be kind or particularly godly to go there and dress in ways that defy their understanding in that context of what modesty is. I think that modesty really means understanding what I should be doing or how I can be humble and be respectful to other people with my clothing in the place that I'm in. Immodesty then would mean clothing or actions or speech that's ostentatious or showy or vain or provocative or appealing to the senses. I think I would like us to focus a little less on what's immodest and focus a little more on what is modest. Focus more on what we should be doing. And yes, I think there is going to be some subjectivity to it. Different people will have a different impression. And I think that's why we need to have conversations as brothers and sisters about the appearance, how we're appearing. And understand, what is the message that my clothing are conveying? What is this? What are you hearing when I wear this? What are you seeing? I believe the focus of modesty needs to be in our minds. I think if it doesn't start there and work out in our daily life from there, it will have no effect on our real life. I would certainly welcome your feedback on this next statement. I think too often modesty gets used primarily in the sense of, immodesty is used in the sense of being sexually suggestive or revealing. And I think we really need to broaden our terminology of modesty versus immodesty past that, to make it bigger than that. And it's true that there are people who struggle with sexual temptations and addictions, and we want to be respectful and caring for the needs that people have. But I think it's a failure to think primarily about modesty in terms of sexual suggestiveness, because I think modesty starts long before that point. And it also fails to address the fact that modesty is an issue for both men and women. Men can be immodest just as much as women in different ways. And so I think we need to avoid getting hung up on what I would call a below-the-neckline modesty and focus on a mental and modesty of the mind. Modest versus immodest, what's the difference? To me, it's like putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It's a very minor difference, but the effect is drastic. And you know it. When I pronounce the word wrong, it's clearly not syllable. It's the wrong syllable. But the difference is the emphasis. The difference is the focus. Where is the focus of my life? And I think we ought to all ask ourselves, whenever I'm interacting with other people, when I am in a place where other people are observing me, where do I want the focus to be, or what do I want people to be thinking about or noticing? Do I want the focus to be me? Do I want the focus to be what I'm wearing, how I look, what social status or social class do I want people to think I belong in? What group do I want people to perceive me to be a part of? What message do I want others to get when they look at my clothing? And I think we do others a favor by being consistent and rational in our message we're communicating. So is the focus me? Or is the focus somewhere else? I believe that if the focus is somewhere else other than me, then my status, my wealth, my beauty, my whatever, you fill in the blank, that's in the background. And I'm not showing that. Part of that, like I said, is contextual. It's going to be perceived different places and by different people differently. I think I've mentioned this before, I was speaking with a contractor who was at Millmont to do some work, and I had him confused. He couldn't figure out how to place me, and he finally just asked, because my hair said one thing and my clothes said something different. And he got too curious and wanted to know what church group I was part of. Now, to be frank, I did need a haircut, and that was probably part of what was throwing him off. But he was reading a message, and it was confusing. You may ask then, if modesty means not focusing on me, then is austerity then equal to godliness? So should we all dress in brown and all the same clothes, so there's no difference, nobody can be differentiated? And I would say, no, I don't think so. I think, well, I wish the word syllable had more syllables in it. It would be a different emphasis on the wrong syllable. Austerity is not equal to godliness. And just because I torture myself, that doesn't make me any more godly. And in fact, in some ways, trying to be austere can actually be a way of drawing attention to myself. Look how plain I am, or look how separate I am from the world, or look at me because I am this. And you notice the attention has now come back to me. But if I'm humble, I don't want the attention to be on me. I want it to be on God. So austerity is not godliness, but I would state that neither is self-expression. Self-expression is not automatically godly any more than austerity is. I think the modern world has told us that we ought to express ourselves and be ourselves. And yes, I think we should. We should be comfortable with ourselves and not be ashamed of the way God made us, or what He's given us, or what our place is in the world. But let's also not make that the focus or draw attention to it. So then am I saying that we should be unbeautiful so that no one notices us? So is unbeauty something to be desired? And I would say no. God makes beautiful things. I think it's a signature God thing. That God makes beautiful things all over the world, and you just open your eyes and there's beauty all around. And God made you and I, and there's a beauty there. But the difference then, I think, between modesty and immodesty is who gets the acknowledgement for that beauty. Where does the praise go? What gets noticed? Is it me that gets noticed, or is it God that gets noticed? And I know that's difficult, because how do we reflect glory to God from the beauty he's given us? But I believe we can make an honest attempt to do that. Some may also object. Why am I responsible for what happens in the mind of the person who sees me? So if I'm dressing in a certain way and I believe it's conveying a message, somebody misreads that message my clothes are sending. Isn't that their problem? Shouldn't I be able to just live what I feel like is a godly life, dress in a way that I think is proper, and if anybody has a problem with that, that's their problem. If they sin as they look at me, that's their sin, not mine. I think there's a slight fallacy there, because I think if my clothing or my accessories bring to your mind a certain image or a certain perception or a concept or association, I'm responsible for that. Just like that contractor who couldn't understand my church affiliation as he looked at me. Yes, I was responsible for some of that perception. Like my illustration of my various coats, if I would be up front here with a torn black t-shirt and a black leather jacket, chains, I think it'd be unfair to say that it's your fault that you're thinking about goths or motorcycle gangs or rock musicians. Those are associations that come with those clothes, and that's fairly understood that those are common associations. In the same way, I think it's somewhat irresponsible to say that the associations, the thoughts, the temptations that someone has when they see how I'm dressed is entirely their responsibility. I agree, I'm not responsible for other people's failures. I'm not. No, there's nothing I can do that's going to prevent someone else from having lust or envy or jealousy. I can't take responsibility for that. But I am responsible for the scene, the part of the scene that I play. I'm responsible for part of what they see. And Paul's words to the church is that it's good to neither eat flesh nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. And I think there's a care that we should have for each other that doesn't put a stumbling block in other people's path. How that looks and how that works out, I think, should be a subject of conversation. We should talk about that. Lastly, I feel like there's a ditch on the other side of the road, too. And that's something I would call tokenization. I don't know if you remember in last Sunday's message, Brother Joe was mentioning the possibility that the cross can become a token. It's just something that you put up there. It means you're a Christian, so there's a cross. But you might not even know what the cross means or have any personal connection to what happened on the cross. You just know that you should be having a cross on display or on a chain around your neck. So if it's a token, it becomes a performative symbol. It's a symbol that I put out there so that, people see it. It makes a statement, but it's not internalized. And I'm afraid that over the years, as our churches have made practical applications of modesty, that those practical applications become performative symbols or tokens. So I do something. I wear a specific piece of clothing because that communicates to other people who I am, not because I've internalized it or understand the meaning for it or want to do that out of a desire to be modest. It's just something I'm supposed to do. I believe this demeans and belittles true modesty just as much as immodesty. Not to say that this historical or traditional practices aren't good and right. In fact, I probably would argue for a lot of them just simply from practicality grounds, and I think this is a good way to do it. But I think we have to be vigorously pushing back against any inclination to have tokens, things we do to tell people who we are without making it an actual matter of the heart or the mind. In conclusion, my call this morning is for all of us to think carefully about how we make decisions about clothing. Yes, it's true, we have concerns about cost, we have concerns about practicality, affordability. Maybe we might be concerned about being perceived as so different as to be unapproachable to the society around us. And those are all valid concerns I think we really need to wrestle with. But I'm convinced this morning that above all of us want to live sanctified and holy lives. I believe we all want to live lives that are set apart for God. And yes, lives lived in clothing that brings glory, attention, and appreciation not to us or to our bodies, but to God. And I do believe that all of us really want to not defraud each other, that we want to extend mercy and grace to each other. And my prayer for each of us and for our continued discussion on clothing standards is that we can together find a practical way of showing humility in our clothing choices. Let's stand for prayer. Father in heaven, I thank you for your word and for the principles you give us there. Father, I pray that each of us would understand how to live lives that are sanctified, that are set apart for you, and that there's no question who we belong to or who we're honoring. Father, you know that sometimes it feels complicated or uncertain to know how to live that out, how to make that practical in everyday experience. And Father, I pray that you would guide our thoughts, our interactions, our words to each other, our conversations, our decisions, all of that, so we can be truly God-honoring, we can truly live holy lives in an unholy and evil world. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated.